The National Geographic Field Guides to the Birds of United States and Canada series just released new and completely revised editions for the East and West, with all new text, data-driven maps, and more species added. But after using it for a couple weeks, I get the feeling that these improvements don't necessarily make it an upgrade, and I keep wondering, who is this book really for? If you're new to this channel, I'm Doug Hitchcox. My goal is to get the most people to see the most birds, and in this video I'm going to review the 2025 editions of the Nat Geo Eastern and Western Bird Guides, and help you decide if they're worth adding to your bookshelf. I'll start with an overview of the books, then share some gripes, plus I've got a few hot takes at the end that I'm curious if you'll agree with. Let's get started with the basics. This is one of the biggest updates we've seen to the Nat Geo series, with the switch of authors to Ted Floyd. These are very complete guides, covering 498 species in the East and 717 species in the West, each with a couple hundred less common and rare species included. The fuzzy geographic boundary between the East and West guides being the Rocky Mountains. Pages are laid out in the traditional format with text and maps on the left and plates on the right, each spread covering 2, 3, or 4 species until you reach the shorter accounts on rare species in the back. Looking closer, the left page starts with an overview of the species presented, usually with some fun fact about the genus. Then within each species there are common and scientific names, and then one of my favorite things is that they included the 4-letter banding code. I know birders have a whole range of feelings about these, but I at least like having them available here, so the next time you're going to post on a rare bird alert, you at least know which codes to use for northern shoveler or northern shrike. But honestly, you should probably just write it out either way. The descriptions of course cover the bird's appearance, vocalization, and general range, but there are also lovely write-ups for each explaining some bit of the bird's natural history, uniqueness, and even some notes on what Ted calls their significance in human affairs. These are basically some fun facts that make the book more readable than just a reference would be. We should also acknowledge the maps. That update was one of the big selling points with this new edition, switching to what are described as ones based on eBird data from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, reviewed and refined by birding experts, first ever in the US-Canada Field Guide. I have a lot of questions about this approach to these new maps, but we'll get to those in a minute. One of the biggest updates, after changing authors, was the inclusion of Hawaiian birds in the Western Guide. Andrew Gutenberg produced some stunning artwork of these birds, from the native Hawaiian finches to the introduced oddities. Both of these guides are about the same size, about 5.5 by 8 inches on the front, about an inch thick, and just under 1.5 pounds. These dimensions aren't particularly unique in any way, but one physical feature specific to the Nat Geo that people seem to love is the thumb tabs for family groups. I always felt like they could have used a couple more here, but at least the 6 chosen are the families most likely to present some identification issues, so you're more likely to quickly need to flip to flycatchers and sparrows than worry too much about the weavers, whitas, waxbills, and wagtails buried between those tabs. Despite all these updates, I have a number of issues with these books. I don't think I'm the only one, so I wanted to share some honest thoughts and ultimately help guide you if you're deciding to buy this book. One surprising part of these issues is that the Nat Geo guide has been around for so long, and it feels like we should be at a place of kind of iterative development, making these books better and better. So when we get an all-new edition, I feel like we really need to see that improvement. The National Geographic Field Guide to the Birds of North America first came out in 1983, and has long been regarded one of the best field guides covering the US and Canada, up there with the OG Peterson and my personal favorite, the Sibley Guide. Despite being 40 years younger than the Peterson series, Nat Geo has gone through just as many editions and will take the lead by the end of this year. The Eastern and Western guides were first released in 2008 and are completely revised now in 2025. So let's take a closer look at some of these big changes. Remember the maps? I need to start by acknowledging a common complaint I've seen online that the political boundary lines are ridiculously faint and hard to read, and some literally disappearing off the page. Ted points out that one of the big shifts with the maps was switching from focusing on the time of year to stages of a bird's annual cycle. So instead of winter, spring, summer, and fall ranges, we see breeding, migration in spring and fall, and wintering. Okay, that's kind of same but different. It is great to have new maps. These are kind of the quickest things to go out of date in most field guides, as bird distributions are always changing. But I'm a bit thrown off about how we were supposed to get these quote data-driven maps from eBird, but they were revised and maybe even made worse. I'll show my main bias for a second and look at some species I'm most familiar with. Yellow-bellied flycatcher. If we pull up the data-driven map on eBird, looking at range and choose static, since this is clearly what guided the field guide's new annual cycle focus, this looks great. So why in the book did they apparently drop tolerances so now the finer details are lost? Yellow-bellied flycatchers just are not breeding in southern Maine, and it looks like someone made the decision to change that from the eBird map. I understand these maps are printed at a really small scale in the guide, so in order to maximize legibility, you may need to overemphasize a little bit. In a recent ABA podcast, Ted commented on how American avocet's range was just too narrow along the East Coast in the eBird maps, so that was expanded to be more visibly accurate. But I really wish these maps were still printed with some of the detail that the actual data-driven maps show. I haven't gone through every species, but Baltimore Oriole was another one that stuck out. It has this big chunk of the Canadian Maritimes filled in, and a completely different wintering range than eBird shows. Rufous hummingbird seems a little tight given the rapid change in their wintering population in the east, and this seems like a downgrade from the map in the 7th edition. So I'm just curious, are the actual data-driven maps that wrong? And there are some funny omissions, like the Eastern Guide giving red-billed pigeon a map, but not Barrow's goldeneye, which actually breeds in the east. And why the heck does Cartloose sandpiper get a map? And speaking about missing maps, all of the Hawaiian birds maps are blank. Ted wrote in the intro that it was because of the scale they opted to show one of 2 maps with annotations below, but surely something could have been printed. It isn't like there aren't data-driven maps available. And speaking of Hawaii, I find its inclusion a bit perplexing. Definitely not surprising since the ABA added Hawaii in 2016, and these books have been taken over by an ABA distinguished staff member. The rebranding from Birds of North America to Birds of United States and Canada is an overdue correction since it's never included Mexico or Greenland, and it makes sense to include Hawaii if it is covering the birds of the United States, but we have to acknowledge their geographic and really genetic isolation makes them seem a bit funny to be just within the Western Guide. I need to emphasize I am thrilled to see them in there, especially as beautifully depicted as they are by Andrew Gutenberg. But having them sprinkled throughout the Western Guide, albeit taxonomically, feels like it makes it kind of less useful as a field guide. I know Ted mentioned in the same podcast reference earlier that he wanted the Hawaiian birds to appear in this order so that you could see how they fit amongst the other birds included, but I feel like it's just going to make it harder to use. If I'm birding in the West, I think I'd rather have black swift for comparison with the other possible swift species than Mariana that will never be seen there. There are plenty of other guides that have included islands with unique bird species, and they are often separated out for easier use. I don't know how easily I'll be able to track this, but I bet it is just a matter of time before someone reports Hawaiian hawk in one of the western contiguous states because someone just says, it looked like the one in my field guide. I have a couple of other things I wanted to point out, which might be more of a personal issue, but you can let me know in the comments if you agree or not. First up, I think these guys just need a big makeover with the artwork. Over the years, many of the species have been expanded upon, like the hummingbirds getting a big makeover a few years ago and new artists contributing to each new edition. This makes for nice updates, but also makes it feel like a bit of a Frankenstein guide. I'm certainly not trying to pick on any of the artwork, but there are some species with mixed artists that really just don't match up, like the kind of funny harlequin duck juxtaposition of Cynthia Howe in Jonathan Alderfer's art. Or between species with different artists side by side, it seems like colors can be a little bit off. I think of Northern Parula as having a paler lemony yellow underneath and Magnolia being more saturated, and the opposite is shown here. Or the differences in the blues used by the illustrators of cliff swallows was just kind of jarring. You'd think that this could have been kind of color matched digitally. There are also some funny naming discrepancies between the Eastern and Western Guide, as seen with cliff swallows using Southwest versus Mexican for the same subspecies. I'll stop this line of thinking here because I know it is a monumental effort to get a guide like this made. I just know that if I ran the show at Nat Geo and had an unlimited budget, I'd be hiring Gutenberg to do a major update for the 3rd edition. Something else I need to point out, but also acknowledge it isn't the fault of the guide, is the taxonomy. There's always a timing issue from when a book is being done written, it needs to go to an editor, more time is needed for the layout and proofing, and it takes a long time to be printed and then distributed, and a lot can change in that time. But one of the selling points for these new editions was that they're, quote, organization based on the most up-to-date taxonomy. But the hard truth is that despite being published in 2025, the taxonomy was only updated through July 2023. So we see updates like the Western flycatcher lump and renaming from the split of goshawks, but not the genus split of accipiter and aster. We're missing the updated Western cattle egret or Northern house wren. Scopolis hasn't been split and redpoll hasn't been lumped. Again, there needs to be a cutoff at some point. It just feels funny to buy a brand new book with the most up-to-date taxonomy, but it isn't. I find it a bit funny, living in 2025, that there isn't an app for these guides. I'm sure it's expensive and maybe you'd lose out on book sales, but even Sibley released a second app with his second edition of his guide, which I happily paid for again. And guess what? That has gotten taxonomic updates since its release, and it's actually just as up to date as this brand new Nat Geo guide is. So the last thing I wanted to address was my earlier question of who is this for? The Nat Geo series is definitely one of the most beloved and best sold bird guides for the US and Canada. I think if you're still using a 4th or 5th edition, the update to maps and taxonomy since those will really be worth it. I do think that the oddly placed Hawaiian birds make this less useful as a field guide and honestly better as a desk reference. But if that's what you're looking for, I'd recommend waiting for the updated 8th edition, combining East and West, which is due out in September. Or if anyone at Nat Geo sees this, make a third guide that is just the birds of Hawaii. I'd quickly drop another $24.99 on that, but only if it actually had range maps. Alright, that's it. I hope this video is helpful for you in deciding if the National Geographic Field Guide to the Birds of Eastern or Western United States and Canada is for you or not. And you can help me with my goal of getting the most people to see the most birds by supporting this channel. You can leave a comment below, tap that like button if this was useful, and make sure you're subscribed. This channel just turned 1 year old and I've got some exciting videos coming up that I don't think you'll want to miss. Thank you.